I think I feel comfortable saying this a couple years out. I'm not quite with this attempt to make him a hero. Like what happened to him was a horrible thing. But this idea that you take him from boyhood up to that night and make it seem like some sort of parable of the black man trying his best and he's almost some sort of role model and you know there must be somebody who's writing an opera about him right now. I don't
Right.
quite I don't quite get that. You know, I don't think he was a monster, but there's something a little weird about that trope as well.
Well, part of the whole victimhood narrative is that it rests upon this idea that is particularly for Black people, we're cleansed, right? We're cleansed of any kind of violence or proactive action that would justify this kind of behavior that in certain instances comes our way. And I feel we have to fight that, you know? It doesn't mean that there aren't instances, particularly of police brutality, that should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law.
Like
But
that
when
one.
we,
Yeah.
but when we get to the point where you can't even ask the question of what were the conditions that led to these incidents, we are robbing our own people of agency, right? We're robbing our own selves of the responsibility of our own behavior.
I agree, but I can hear I can hear the counter argument. You want to talk about conditions, okay? Well, maybe George Floyd was passing a counterfeit $20 bill and maybe he was resisting arrest, but the deeper conditions, the conditions of poverty, structural racism, etc. I mean, George Floyd had an
Yep.
education or didn't have one. George Floyd had a job or he didn't have one. He came from a community where there were investments being made or were not being made.
Yep.
He was confronted by a system of which Derek Chauvin, the police officer, is merely an agent or representative, but the structures of power that suppress people like George Floyd run far beyond that, and that the lionization of the individual George Floyd is not a celebration of his way of life. It's rather seizing upon a symbol which is at hand, his murder by Derek Chauvin, to amplify our protest and discontent with the larger structural issues so that when you fixate, he didn't have his shoelaces tied right. He walked with a limp. He didn't speak politely to the police officer. You trivialize the deep issues of justice and power that are at play in an incident like George Floyd.
Yeah. Well,
That would be the counter argument.
No, I think it's a solid counter argument because there is wisdom in that. I mean, that is that's the complexity and nuance that in some ways I do try to address in my book, Agency, because I do see these two meta narratives that I think apply here, right? The kind of what I call the blame the system versus the blame the victim narrative, right? In the blame the system narrative, that's what you hear most of, particularly from the progressive left, which basically says, it's the systems, it's the lack, America itself is this oppressive nation that based on your race or your gender or some other immutable characteristic, the systems are rigged against you. George Floyd never had a shot, right? He probably didn't have access to great schools. The schools that he did have access to were pretty crappy. He may have lived in a situation that had lots of deprivation, right? And that is the blame the system to the core argument. There's a white supremacist lurking on every corner. Capitalism itself is evil. And these systems are so rigged, so discriminatory, so powerful that you, and let's put on race, as you as a young Black person have no shot in this system, right? In addition, though, there is this other narrative that I am very empathetic to, which is part of the reason I run schools, which is the blame the victim narrative. Right? And that narrative says, you're responsible. You're responsible for your own failure. You didn't pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? You didn't take advantage of all the opportunities that America has laid out in front of you. The problem with that narrative, of course, is that it's really hard to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps if you were born into an unstable family, not supported by a faith community, don't have access to school choice. The situation around you potentially is bleak, right? And so we have to have an empowering alternative to the blame the system and the blame the victim narrative. Because I think what you just laid out, um, Glenn, is we have to acknowledge that there are kids growing up in that kind of situation that you just described. George Floyd. That doesn't mean that George Floyd isn't still ultimately responsible for the actions that he took on that day. But we do have to be cognizant of the conditions that we all should be working towards. And that's why I've put forth agency and this framework around free family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship as my, I can't just shout in the rain. I have to put forth my empowering alternative for young people to embrace to get far different outcomes than George Floyd did.
Can I ask you something, Ian?
Yep.
George Floyd, I don't remember the conditions. I'm making this up. I'm making him an archetype. George Floyd has a sister. I'm just guessing. And George Floyd's sister works as a school teacher, or George Floyd's sister works as a security guard, or George Floyd's sister is some sort of entrepreneur. George went a different way. We see that with this kind of Black family all the time. What is it that George Floyd's sister, in quotation marks, did that he didn't? My thought is always that part of it is what the Black community has been taught to see as a norm, not as ideal, but as a norm. I think there's a lack of a basic recoil towards a certain direction that there used to be more of. Nobody was perfect in 1950, but there was more of a recoil among more people towards going in a certain direction, and things changed in the late 60s. What is it that his sister did that he didn't, and how can we teach more people to do what his sister did? Or he has a brother who's a security guard and is doing just fine, or he's a plumber, but George kind of went the wrong way. What happened?
I mean, it's a hypothetical, but if we are to hypothesize, both the sister and the brother you both described as being employed, so that is a fundamental that they're working. And so inherent in that is a certain level of dignity and discipline that comes along with having to show up for a job on time. It's likely that, again, this is hypothetical, but I would imagine that if they did not have a child outside of marriage, that would have put them in a dramatically different situation than I think George Floyd, who I do believe had children outside of marriage. And again, that single fact doesn't necessarily condemn someone to a life of horror. We know there are many stories of kids being born into single parent homes who become successful, while there are people born to married two-parent households who are not successful. But the data is overwhelming if you look at the profile. And when you talk about norms, in the Black family, as you guys talk about all the time, you talk about 1950, that's when the marriage rates amongst the Black community were, I believe, even higher than that of the white community. They were on a decline at that point, unfortunately, because of new norms, and some argue welfare policies starting in the 60s, that actually started to create perverse incentives around things like marriage and the responsibility of work and finishing your education. All these things matter a lot. And again, I try to write about these things in agency, not in a way to be, I don't know, punitive.
Censorious. Yeah, you never are. Right, exactly.
Yeah, because I don't think that helps win people to your side. I try to show empathy for, I'll say it, for George Floyd's life beforehand. The guy, as I understand it, was a convicted felon, or he armed robbery of a pregnant woman. I don't know if these things are true, but these are certainly the media reports. That kind of behavior deserves to be, incarcerated, but again, we should be able to do two things at the same time, which is to penalize behavior which is completely antisocial and dangerous, while also understanding the conditions that led to it, and hold people accountable.